I never imagined that being called a hoarder at my father's 67th birthday party would lead to the most satisfying moment of my entire life. For 15 years, my family had mocked my collection of what they called worthless junk, pushing me to throw everything away and get my life together. They had no idea that hidden among those dusty boxes and forgotten furniture pieces was a treasure worth more than all their combined life savings. That moment of vindication came when Dr. Amanda Price from Heritage Auction House walked into our family gathering and uttered three words that changed everything forever: extraordinary museum quality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and according to my family, I was a 32-year-old woman who couldn't let go of anything. The sister who lived in a cluttered rental house on Elm Street, surrounded by what my mother dismissively called dusty old things and what my brother described as a fire hazard waiting to happen. For the past 15 years, ever since I'd started seriously collecting antiques and vintage items, my family had treated me like someone with a psychological disorder who needed professional intervention. What they saw when they visited my modest two-bedroom house was chaos. Boxes stacked in every corner, vintage furniture crowding the rooms, and shelves lined with porcelain figurines, old books, and collections they couldn't understand. They saw someone who couldn't make rational decisions about what to keep and what to discard. Someone who was so emotionally attached to material possessions that she'd chosen objects over relationships, over a normal life, over their approval. What they didn't know was that every single item in my collection had been carefully researched, authenticated, and acquired through years of dedicated study. That modest rental house on Elm Street was actually a carefully curated repository of American decorative arts spanning 3 centuries. The dusty boxes contained museum-quality pieces I'd discovered at estate sales, flea markets, and auctions across the Midwest. The cluttered rooms held treasures that collectors and institutions had been searching for decades. My journey into serious collecting had begun innocently enough during college when I'd found a beautiful Victorian silver tea service at a garage sale for $20. Something about the craftsmanship had caught my eye, and I'd spent hours researching the maker's marks when I got home. That tea service turned out to be worth nearly $3,000, made by a prominent Boston silversmith in 1847. The thrill of that discovery, the satisfaction of recognizing value where others saw only tarnished metal, had ignited a passion that would define the next 15 years of my life. But my family had never understood that passion. To them, my growing collection represented an inability to move forward, to embrace minimalism and modern living like my successful brother Michael had done. They saw my weekend trips to estate sales and auctions as escapism, my careful preservation of historical objects as an unhealthy attachment to the past. Every family gathering became an opportunity for them to express their concern about my lifestyle choices and to suggest, with increasing urgency, that I needed professional help. The irony was profound and painful. While they worried about my inability to function in the modern world, I had actually become an expert in a field that few people truly understood. I could identify pottery makers by their glazing techniques, recognize furniture styles from specific regions and time periods, and spot reproductions from across a crowded auction hall. I had developed relationships with dealers, collectors, and museum curators who respected my knowledge and sought my opinions on difficult attributions. My expertise had grown to the point where I was quietly consulting for several auction houses and private collectors, helping them identify and value pieces for their sales and exhibitions. The fees from these consultations, combined with the strategic buying and selling of carefully selected items, had allowed me to build a collection that was worth significantly more than anyone in my family could imagine. But I had learned to keep these professional activities hidden, partly because I didn't want to deal with their skepticism, and partly because I had begun to understand that my family needed me to be the problem child. My brother Michael Mitchell was everything our parents had dreamed of in a successful child. At 35, he owned Mitchell & Associates Realty, the most prestigious real estate firm in Millbrook. He lived in a stunning contemporary home in Riverside Heights with his wife Jennifer, an interior designer who specialized in the kind of clean minimalist spaces that appeared in home and garden magazines. Their 2 children, Tommy and Emma, attended private school and took piano lessons and played soccer in organized leagues. Michael's world was one of clean lines, neutral colors, and carefully controlled environments where every object had a specific purpose and designated place. His success was measured in square footage sold, commission checks deposited, and the admiration of clients who trusted him to find them perfect homes in perfect neighborhoods. He drove a new BMW, wore expensive suits, and belonged to the country club where he played golf with other successful businessmen every Saturday morning. The contrast between Michael's streamlined success and my cluttered existence couldn't have been more stark, and he never missed an opportunity to point this out. Every time he visited my house, he would shake his head in bewilderment at my collections, making comments about fire codes and property values and the impossibility of finding anything in such chaos. He genuinely believed that my attachment to old objects represented some kind of mental deficiency, an inability to embrace progress and modernity the way he had done. Michael was also genuinely concerned about my future, though his concern was expressed in ways that felt more like judgment than support. He worried that I would never find a serious relationship because no one would want to live surrounded by so much stuff. He worried that I was wasting my life chasing after worthless objects instead of building a career that could provide financial security.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Most of all, he worried that I was becoming increasingly isolated from normal social connections, choosing the company of dead people's possessions over living relationships. Our parents, Patricia and Robert Mitchell, had long since accepted that their children had chosen very different paths in life, but their disappointment in my choices was barely concealed. Mom, who had spent 30 years teaching elementary school before retiring, approached my collecting habit with the same patience she had once shown struggling students. She would listen to my explanations about historical significance and artistic merit with polite attention, then gently suggest that perhaps I didn't need quite so many examples of the same type of object. Dad, who had worked as a supervisor at the local factory until it closed 5 years ago, was more direct in his concerns. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to surround themselves with old furniture and dishes when new things were readily available and much more practical. He worried about the money I spent on what he considered junk, even though I had tried to explain that most pieces in my collection had appreciated significantly in value since I'd acquired them. The family dynamic had crystallized into a familiar pattern over the years. Michael was the success story, the child who had made smart choices and built a life that reflected well on their parenting. I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when someone became too attached to impractical dreams and refused to accept conventional definitions of achievement and progress. Extended family members had joined this narrative with enthusiasm. Aunt Dorothy, who managed loan applications at First National Bank, regularly reminded me that banks didn't accept antique furniture as collateral for mortgages. Uncle Frank, who owned Hayes Auto Repair, couldn't understand why I bought old things when his business was built on replacing old things with new ones. Even family friends like Mrs. Helen Carter, who had known me since childhood, had begun to treat me with the kind of gentle sympathy reserved for people who had lost their way in life. The most frustrating aspect of their attitude was how they dismissed my knowledge and expertise without ever taking the time to understand what I had actually learned. When I tried to explain the historical significance of a particular piece, they would nod politely and change the subject. When I mentioned successful sales or interesting discoveries, they would make comments about how I could have spent that time on more productive activities. They had decided that my passion was a problem, and no amount of evidence to the contrary could convince them otherwise. But I had learned to live with their disapproval, partly because I genuinely loved what I was doing, and partly because I had begun to understand something important about family dynamics. Michael needed to be the successful one, and for him to maintain that position, I needed to be the unsuccessful one. My role in the family was to provide contrast, to be the example of roads not taken and choices not made. If I suddenly became obviously successful in my own field, it would disrupt the entire narrative they had constructed about themselves and their values. So I had allowed them to maintain their assumptions while quietly building expertise and connections that they knew nothing about. I attended auctions and estate sales on weekends while they assumed I was just wandering around aimlessly. I consulted with museum curators and private collectors while they believed I was just playing with old dishes. I had developed relationships with some of the most respected experts in American decorative arts, while my family worried that I was becoming socially isolated. The financial reality of my situation was something I had kept completely private. While my family worried about my ability to support myself, the truth was that my collection had become extremely valuable. Conservative estimates put the total worth at somewhere around $250,000, but I suspected that several key pieces might be worth significantly more than even I realized. I had been approached by collectors and museums interested in acquiring specific items, but I had turned down most offers because I was still learning and discovering new things about pieces I had owned for years. More importantly, I had built relationships within the collecting community that provided both personal satisfaction and professional opportunities. I was regularly invited to preview exhibitions at major museums, consulted on attribution questions by auction houses, and asked to speak at collector conferences about my areas of specialization. These activities provided not just intellectual stimulation but also consulting fees that had allowed me to continue acquiring important pieces without touching my savings account. But none of this professional recognition mattered to my family because they never asked about it and wouldn't have understood its significance if I had tried to explain. In their minds, I was still the sister who couldn't let go of old things, who lived in a cluttered house surrounded by dusty objects that prevented her from moving forward with her life. They saw someone who needed their help and guidance, someone whose poor choices served as a reminder of their own wisdom in embracing conventional success. The psychological toll of living this double life had been significant but manageable. I had learned to smile and nod when they offered advice about decluttering and life organization. I had mastered the art of appearing grateful when they suggested that I might be happier if I just got rid of most of my things and started fresh. I could make myself small enough to fit into their narrative of the family member who needed rescue and guidance. But maintaining this facade was becoming increasingly difficult as my expertise grew and my reputation within the collecting community expanded. Last month I had been asked to authenticate a collection for the Cleveland Museum of Art, and my attribution had led to a major acquisition that would be featured in their upcoming American Decorative Arts exhibition. 2 weeks ago, Heritage Auction House had consulted with me about a group of pottery that had been misidentified in their catalog, and my correction had increased the estimated value by over $30,000. These professional achievements were deeply satisfying, but they also highlighted the strange contradiction of my situation. I was becoming recognized as an expert in my field while my own family continued to treat me like someone who couldn't make rational decisions about material possessions. The respected consultant who helped museums and auction houses was the same person my brother wanted to stage an intervention for because she had too much stuff in her house. The most recent family gathering had been particularly difficult. Michael had brought Jennifer to look at my house with her interior designer's eye, ostensibly to help me organize and declutter, but actually to demonstrate just how far my living situation had fallen below acceptable standards. Jennifer had walked through my rooms, taking notes and making suggestions about furniture placement and storage solutions, completely missing the fact that she was looking at a carefully curated collection of historical objects that belonged in a museum. Her suggestions had been well-meaning, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what she was seeing. She wanted me to get rid of the Victorian furniture because it was too dark and heavy for modern living. She couldn't understand why I needed so many dishes when a basic set from a contemporary store would be much more practical. She was particularly concerned about the books, suggesting that I could probably find digital versions of anything I really needed to reference. The conversation had been painful not because Jennifer was trying to be cruel, but because her suggestions revealed just how completely my family misunderstood the nature and value of what I had collected. To her trained designer's eye, my house was cluttered with outdated objects that prevented good traffic flow and created visual chaos. She couldn't see the museum-quality American furniture, the rare pottery, or the historically significant textiles, because she was looking at everything through the lens of contemporary design principles. But tonight was going to be different, though I had no way of knowing it yet. Tonight at Dad's 67th birthday celebration, the carefully maintained separation between my public reputation and my private family life was about to collide in the most unexpected way possible. Dr. Amanda Price from Heritage Auction House was coming to Millbrook to authenticate a collection for a local estate, and through a series of coincidences that still seemed impossible, she was going to end up at our family gathering just as my relatives were planning their most serious intervention yet. The irony was that I had been corresponding with Dr. Price for months about several pieces in my collection, pieces that she had expressed serious interest in featuring in Heritage's upcoming important American Decorative Arts auction. She knew me only as S. Mitchell, the knowledgeable collector who had provided insights that had helped her identify several significant pieces for other clients. She had no idea that the expert consultant she respected was the same person whose family was planning to stage an intervention to save her from her hoarding problem. As I prepared for Dad's birthday party, carefully selecting a modest outfit that wouldn't draw attention to myself, I had no idea that within a few hours Dr. Amanda Price would be standing in my parents' living room, treating me with the kind of professional respect that my family had never witnessed. I had no idea that the woman my brother planned to rescue from her attachment to worthless junk was about to be revealed as someone whose expertise was sought by the most prestigious auction house in the region. The boxes of ceramics that my family wanted me to donate to Goodwill contained pieces that Dr. Price had been hoping to find for years. The furniture they considered outdated and impractical included examples that museums had been trying to acquire for their collections. The cluttered, chaotic environment they wanted to help me escape was actually a treasure trove that collectors and institutions had been searching for across the country. But for now I was still just Sarah, the sister who couldn't let go of old things, heading to a family birthday party where everyone would continue to treat me like someone whose poor choices served as a reminder of their own wisdom in choosing conventional success over impractical dreams. Part 2: The Hidden Truth Details. What my family didn't understand was that my modest rental house on Elm Street was merely the visible tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than anyone could imagine. The cluttered rooms they worried about represented only a fraction of my actual collection. The real treasure was housed in a climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of town, where I maintained 3 units filled with pieces too valuable to risk keeping in an ordinary house. Storage Unit 47 contained American furniture from the colonial period through the arts and crafts movement, including a secretary desk attributed to John Goddard of Newport that I had discovered at an estate sale in rural Pennsylvania. The dealer running the sale had priced it at $800, seeing only an old desk with some veneer damage. I had recognized the distinctive shell carving and proportions that marked it as the work of one of America's master cabinet makers. Conservative auction estimates for authenticated Goddard pieces started at $75,000, and exceptional examples had sold for well over $200,000. Unit 48 housed my pottery collection, which had grown to include pieces by virtually every important American ceramics manufacturer from the 18th century through the modern studio movement. The crown jewel was a large chardonneret by George Orr, the eccentric potter from Biloxi, whose work was dismissed during his lifetime but had become increasingly sought after by collectors and museums. I had found it buried under boxes of common pottery at an estate sale, its twisted asymmetrical form covered in a lustrous glaze that caught the light in ways that seemed almost magical. Similar pieces by Orr had recently sold at auction for prices approaching 6 figures. Unit 49 contained what I considered my research library, thousands of books on American decorative arts, auction catalogs dating back to the 1920s, and files of correspondence with dealers, collectors, and museum curators. This wasn't just a collection of books but a comprehensive archive documenting the history and provenance of American craftsmanship. Several universities had expressed interest in acquiring my research materials for their art history programs, recognizing that I had assembled resources that weren't available anywhere else. The deception I maintained about the true scope of my collection wasn't motivated by shame or secrecy, but by practical necessity. Insurance costs for properly covering such valuable items would have been enormous, and keeping everything in one location would have created security risks that I couldn't afford to manage. More importantly, I had learned that most people, including my family, weren't capable of understanding the difference between old things and truly important historical objects. To them, a 19th-century shaker chair and a 1970s reproduction from a furniture store were essentially the same thing, both examples of outdated design that prevented proper room organization. My expertise had developed through 15 years of intensive study and hands-on experience that would have impressed anyone who understood the field. I could identify regional characteristics in furniture construction that allowed me to distinguish between pieces made in Philadelphia versus those made in Boston during the same period. I understood the chemical composition of glazes well enough to spot modern reproductions of historic pottery from across a crowded auction hall. I had memorized the mark systems used by hundreds of American silversmiths and could often attribute unmarked pieces based solely on construction techniques and stylistic details. This knowledge had been acquired through thousands of hours spent in museums, libraries, and archives, studying objects and documents that most people would find tediously academic. I had traveled to conferences and workshops where I learned from the leading experts in various specialties, building relationships with scholars and collectors who shared my passion for understanding American decorative arts. I subscribed to professional journals, maintained memberships in collector organizations, and participated in online forums where attribution questions were debated by people whose expertise rivaled that of museum curators. The financial aspects of my collecting had evolved far beyond simple buying and selling. I had developed sophisticated strategies for acquiring undervalued pieces, often spending months researching the provenance and exhibition history of objects before making purchase decisions. I understood market trends well enough to predict which categories of objects were likely to appreciate in value, and I had built relationships with dealers who offered me first opportunities to purchase exceptional pieces. My consulting work had grown organically from my reputation for accurate attributions and deep knowledge of American decorative arts history. Auction houses regularly sent me photographs of pieces they were having trouble identifying, and my opinions often influenced their catalog descriptions and estimated values. Private collectors sought my advice when they were considering major purchases, knowing that I could spot problems that might not be apparent to less experienced eyes. Museums consulted with me when they were evaluating potential acquisitions, particularly in cases where provenance or attribution questions needed to be resolved. The fees from this consulting work had become substantial enough to support my collecting activities without requiring me to sell pieces from my own collection. Last year alone, I had earned over $40,000 from authentication services, condition reports, and advisory consultations. This income wasn't something I advertised to my family, partly because they wouldn't have understood the nature of the work, and partly because it would have complicated their narrative about my inability to generate practical income from my interests. The most rewarding aspect of my expertise was the detective work involved in discovering the stories behind objects that had been forgotten or misunderstood. Every piece in my collection came with research files documenting its history, previous ownership, and significance, within the broader context of American decorative arts. I had traced pieces back to their original makers, identified objects that had been exhibited in important early shows, and discovered connections between seemingly unrelated items that revealed patterns in American taste and craftsmanship. One of my most significant discoveries had involved a group of silver pieces that I had acquired separately over several years. Through careful research, I had determined that they all came from the same original service, created for a prominent Boston family in the 1760s. The discovery that these pieces were part of a documented historical set had increased their individual values dramatically, but more importantly, it had contributed to
Scholarly understanding of pre-revolutionary silver production in New England. These kinds of discoveries were what motivated my collecting beyond any financial considerations. Each object represented a connection to specific people and historical moments, and the research required to understand these connections had taught me more about American history than any formal education could have provided. I had learned about immigration patterns by studying the distribution of specific pottery types, understood economic cycles through the evolution of furniture styles, and gained insights into social changes by examining the decorative objects that different generations had considered important enough to preserve. But none of this scholarly satisfaction mattered to my family because they never asked about my research and wouldn't have understood its significance if I had tried to explain it. To them, spending hours in libraries and archives researching the history of old objects was just another example of my inability to focus on practical concerns. They saw someone who was so obsessed with the past that she couldn't engage effectively with the present, someone whose time would be better spent developing skills that could lead to conventional career advancement. The irony was that my unconventional path had actually led to exactly the kind of professional recognition that they valued, just in a field they didn't understand or respect. Within the American decorative arts community, I was known as someone whose opinions carried weight and whose research contributed to scholarly understanding. I was regularly invited to speak at conferences, contribute to exhibition catalogs, and participate in attribution committees that determined the authenticity and significance of important pieces. This professional recognition had opened doors that would have been impossible to access through conventional career paths. I had been given private tours of museum storage areas where the public never went, allowed to handle objects that were usually viewed only through display cases, and included in conversations with curators and collectors who shared knowledge that wasn't available in published sources. These experiences had deepened my understanding in ways that couldn't be replicated through formal education or traditional job training. The personal satisfaction I derived from this work was something my family couldn't understand because they measured success primarily through financial metrics and social recognition. They couldn't see that I had found something that combined intellectual challenge, historical discovery, and aesthetic appreciation in ways that made every day feel like an adventure. The thrill of identifying an important piece that others had overlooked, the satisfaction of solving an attribution puzzle that had stumped other experts, the joy of discovering beautiful objects that represented the best of American craftsmanship, these were rewards that couldn't be quantified in terms they would recognize. Part 3. The Golden Child antagonist introduction. Michael's success story was one that our parents never tired of telling. A narrative of smart choices and steady progress that validated everything they believed about the rewards of conventional achievement. From his high school years as student body president through his graduation from Ohio State with a business degree, Michael had followed a path that led predictably and inevitably to the kind of prosperity that small-town families dream about for their children. Mitchell and Associates Realty had grown from a one-person operation that Michael started in his mid-20s to the most respected real estate firm in Millbrook, with 8 agents and annual sales volume that consistently topped $15 million. Michael's success wasn't just about selling houses but about understanding what upwardly mobile families wanted and helping them find properties that represented their aspirations for better lives. He specialized in executive relocations, luxury homes and investment properties, serving clients who appreciated his attention to detail and professional demeanor. The office of Mitchell and Associates occupied a beautifully restored Victorian mansion on Main Street, its elegant interior designed by Jennifer to project exactly the right combination of traditional stability and contemporary sophistication. Michael had chosen the location carefully, understanding that successful real estate professionals needed to project success themselves. Clients who were investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in property purchases wanted to work with someone whose own choices demonstrated good judgment and financial acumen. Michael's personal life reflected the same careful attention to image and substance that characterized his professional success. His marriage to Jennifer had brought together two people whose talents complemented each other perfectly, creating a partnership that enhanced both their individual careers and their shared social standing. Jennifer's interior design business had flourished partly because of referrals from Michael's real estate clients, while her aesthetic sensibilities had helped him create the kind of professional environment that attracted high-end customers. Their home in Riverside Heights was a showcase for both their talents and their values, a contemporary design that maximized space and light while maintaining the kind of understated elegance that appeared in architectural magazines. Every room demonstrated Jennifer's mastery of current design trends, from the open-concept kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, to the master suite with its spa-like bathroom and walk-in closets organized with professional efficiency. The house served as both family residence and subtle marketing tool, a demonstration of what successful living looked like in modern Millbrook. Michael's clients often commented on the beauty and functionality of the space, reinforcing his reputation as someone who understood quality and had achieved the kind of lifestyle that others aspired to reach. The monthly payment on their mortgage was substantial, but it was an investment in professional image as well as personal comfort, a calculation that had proven its worth through increased business and social connections. Michael's relationship with his children reflected the same thoughtful approach that characterized all his major decisions. Tommy and Emma attended Millbrook Academy, a private school that emphasized both academic excellence and character development, preparing them for the kind of higher education opportunities that would maintain their family's upward trajectory. Michael coached Tommy's soccer team and attended Emma's piano recitals, maintaining the kind of active parental involvement that demonstrated his commitment to family values while building relationships with other successful parents in their community. The family's recreational activities were chosen with the same strategic thinking that Michael applied to business decisions. Their country club membership provided opportunities for both relaxation and networking, allowing Michael to build relationships with potential clients while giving his family access to facilities and programs that enhanced their quality of life. Family vacations were planned to destinations that offered both enjoyment and cultural enrichment, from ski trips to Colorado to educational tours of historical sites that reinforced the children's appreciation for American heritage. Michael's civic involvement further demonstrated his commitment to the community that had supported his success. He served on the Chamber of Commerce Board, participated in United Way campaigns, and volunteered his time for organizations that promoted economic development and quality of life improvements in Millbrook. These activities weren't just expressions of social responsibility but investments in the kind of community that attracted the successful families who became his clients. The contrast between Michael's organized, purposeful lifestyle and my cluttered, seemingly directionless existence couldn't have been more stark, and Michael never hesitated to point out this difference whenever family conversations turned to future planning or goal setting. He genuinely believed that his success resulted from making smart choices and maintaining focus on achievable objectives, while my situation demonstrated what happened when someone became distracted by impractical interests and refused to accept conventional definitions of progress. Michael's concern about my lifestyle was authentic, rooted in his belief that I was wasting opportunities and limiting my potential for happiness by refusing to embrace the kind of planning and organization that had worked so well for him. He couldn't understand why I chose to live surrounded by old objects when I could have used that same energy and resources to create the kind of clean, efficient environment that supported professional advancement and personal growth. His suggestions for improving my situation always involved some version of the same basic strategy: get rid of most of my possessions, organize what remained according to practical criteria, and focus my attention on activities that could lead to conventional career advancement. He believed that my attachment to historical objects was preventing me from engaging fully with present opportunities, and that my cluttered living space was both a symptom and a cause of my inability to make progress toward normal adult goals. Michael's wife Jennifer approached my situation with the professional perspective of someone whose career involved helping people create functional, beautiful living spaces. She understood that environments strongly influenced behavior and mood, and she believed that my cluttered surroundings were actively preventing me from feeling motivated and optimistic about my future. Her suggestions for improving my house were always practical and well-intentioned, focused on storage solutions and organization systems that could help me regain control over my physical environment. Jennifer's design aesthetic emphasized simplicity, functionality, and contemporary style, principles that put her in direct conflict with my appreciation for historical objects and period decorating approaches. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose heavy Victorian furniture over sleek modern pieces, or why someone would want to display dozens of old dishes when a few carefully chosen contemporary items would create much more visual impact. Her training taught her to eliminate visual clutter and create spaces that felt calm and unencumbered, goals that seemed impossible to achieve in rooms filled with antique collections. The children had absorbed their parents' attitudes about organization and modern living, often commenting during family visits about how different my house felt from their own clean, organized home. Tommy and Emma weren't cruel about these differences, but their innocent observations often highlighted just how far my lifestyle had diverged from what they considered normal family life. They couldn't understand why I had so many books when everything could be found on the internet, or why I kept so many dishes when their family used the same set every day without any problems. Michael's professional success had given him confidence in his judgment about practical matters, and he often spoke about my situation with the authority of someone who had proven his ability to make smart decisions and achieve positive results. He genuinely believed that his advice could help me improve my circumstances if I would just accept his guidance and implement the changes he recommended. His frustration with my resistance to these suggestions was rooted in his certainty that he understood what needed to be done and his confusion about why I couldn't see the obvious benefits of following his example. The family dynamic that had developed around our contrasting lifestyles put Michael in the position of the successful son whose achievements validated our parents' values and approaches to life. While I represented the cautionary tale of what happened when someone rejected practical advice and pursued impractical interests, this role assignment wasn't deliberately cruel, but it created a framework where Michael's opinions about my choices carried special weight because they came from someone who had demonstrably figured out how to build a successful life. Michael's business success had also given him financial resources that allowed him to be generous with family members, creating additional dynamics around his role as the child who had achieved prosperity. He regularly picked up restaurant checks during family gatherings, contributed generously to his children's education and activities, and helped our parents with home maintenance projects that were beyond their budget. These gestures weren't calculated to make anyone feel inferior, but they reinforced his position as the family member who had achieved the kind of financial stability that allowed him to help others. The most painful aspect of Michael's attitude toward my collecting wasn't his criticism of my choices, but his genuine inability to understand that my interests might represent something valuable, rather than just a problematic attachment to unnecessary objects. He had never taken the time to learn about American decorative arts, or to understand the difference between random accumulation and serious collecting. To him, old furniture was just furniture that should be replaced with newer, more functional pieces, and vintage dishes were just dishes that created unnecessary storage problems. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that all his advice about decluttering and organization was based on the assumption that most of what I owned was essentially worthless except for whatever sentimental value I attached to it. He couldn't imagine that my collections might have significant monetary value or scholarly importance because he had never bothered to research these possibilities. His suggestions for improvement always involved getting rid of most of my possessions because he genuinely believed that these objects were preventing me from moving forward with my life. Part 4. Supporting caste and systematic dismissal. Our parents had developed their own version of patient disappointment regarding my lifestyle choices. A mixture of concern and resignation that reflected their genuine love for me, combined with their complete inability to understand what I was trying to accomplish. Mom's approach was rooted in her decades of experience as an elementary school teacher, treating my collecting habits with the same gentle persistence she had once used to help struggling students overcome learning difficulties. Patricia Mitchell had retired from Millbrook Elementary 5 years ago, but she still approached family problems with the systematic patience that had made her an effective educator. She genuinely believed that my attachment to old objects represented an emotional issue that could be resolved through careful guidance and gradual behavior modification. Her suggestions always involved small, manageable changes that she hoped would eventually lead to larger improvements in my overall lifestyle and happiness. Mom's concern was most evident in her careful attention to my emotional state during family gatherings, watching for signs that my isolation and cluttered living situation were affecting my mental health and social connections. She worried that I was becoming increasingly withdrawn from normal relationships, choosing the company of inanimate objects over the kind of human connections that provided emotional support and personal growth. Her offers to help me organize and declutter always came with gentle reminders about the importance of creating space for new experiences and relationships. The specific suggestions Mom made revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what she was observing in my collections. She would recommend keeping only a few pieces from each category, assuming that I was holding on to everything because I couldn't make rational decisions about which items were actually important to me. She couldn't understand that each piece in my collection had been chosen for specific reasons related to its historical significance, artistic merit, or role in documenting American decorative arts traditions. Dad's approach was more direct and practical, rooted in his decades of experience as a factory supervisor, where problems were solved through systematic analysis and efficient implementation of solutions. Robert Mitchell had spent his career managing production schedules and maintaining equipment, developing a no-nonsense approach to problem solving that emphasized practical results over theoretical considerations. Dad's concern about my collecting focused primarily on the financial aspects of my situation, worrying that I was spending money on objects that wouldn't provide any return on investment while neglecting practical needs like home maintenance and retirement planning. He couldn't understand why anyone would choose to buy old furniture when new pieces were available at reasonable prices and came with warranties and guarantees. His suggestions always involved selling most of my collection and using the proceeds to establish more conventional forms of financial security. The factory closure 5 years ago had left Dad with a modest pension and Social Security income that provided basic security but limited flexibility for unexpected expenses. His awareness of financial vulnerability made him particularly concerned about my apparent lack of conventional career planning and income generation. He genuinely worried that I was creating a situation where I would eventually face serious financial difficulties, without the safety net of steady employment and traditional benefits. Dad's suggestions for improving my situation always involved some version of converting my interests into more practical activities. Perhaps working for an antique shop or auction house where I could use my knowledge to earn regular income while gradually reducing my personal collection to a manageable size. He understood that I enjoyed learning about old objects, but he couldn't see why this interest needed to dominate my living space and consume so much of my financial resources. Aunt Dorothy's perspective on my situation was shaped by her experience as a loan manager at First National Bank, where she spent her days evaluating people's financial stability and creditworthiness. Her professional training had taught her to identify the warning signs of poor financial decision-making, and my collecting habits displayed several characteristics that would raise red flags in a loan application review. Dorothy's concerns were particularly focused on the lack of liquid assets and conventional income sources that would be necessary for major purchases like a house or car. She couldn't understand how I expected to achieve normal adult milestones when so much of my money was tied up in objects that couldn't easily be converted to cash if I needed them for practical purposes. Her suggestions always involved establishing more traditional forms of savings and investment that would provide security and flexibility for future planning. The monthly family dinners at our parents' house had become informal consulting sessions where Dorothy would share advice about financial planning and debt management, always with gentle references to my situation as an example of how unconventional choices could create unnecessary complications. She genuinely wanted to help me achieve financial stability, but her definition of stability didn't include any recognition that collections could represent legitimate forms of investment or value preservation. Uncle Frank approached my situation with the practical skepticism of someone whose business was built on fixing things that were broken and replacing parts that had worn out. Hayes Auto Repair had thrived for 20 years because Frank understood that most mechanical problems had straightforward solutions that didn't require complicated analysis or emotional attachment to failed components. Frank's attitude toward my collecting reflected his professional experience with customers who held onto vehicles that were beyond economical repair, investing time and money in restoration projects that never provided practical transportation or reasonable return on investment. He saw my attachment to old furniture and dishes as a similar form of misguided sentimentality, keeping objects that had outlived their useful purpose instead of replacing them with modern alternatives that would function better and require less maintenance. The suggestions Frank made about my situation always involved practical applications of his automotive philosophy: keep what works, fix what can be repaired economically, and replace everything else with newer, more reliable alternatives. He couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live with old heating systems, outdated appliances, and furniture that required special care when modern replacements would be more efficient and dependable. Mrs. Helen Carter represented the broader community perspective on my lifestyle choices, carrying the collective wisdom of neighbors who had known me since childhood and watched my development with the kind of invested interest that small towns maintain in their young people. Her concerns reflected the social expectations and conventional values that shaped most people's understanding of appropriate adult behavior and responsible decision-making. Helen's observations about my situation were always framed in terms of missed opportunities and delayed milestones, comparing my current circumstances to those of other people my age who had achieved marriage, home ownership, and career advancement. She genuinely cared about my happiness and future prospects, but her definitions of success and fulfillment were rooted in traditional patterns that didn't include room for unconventional interests or alternative approaches to building a meaningful life. The specific suggestions Helen offered reflected her belief that my social isolation and unusual lifestyle were preventing me from experiencing the kind of conventional happiness that came through normal relationships and community involvement. She regularly invited me to church activities and social events where I might meet appropriate men and develop the kind of connections that could lead to marriage and family formation. Her concern was always expressed with kindness, but it carried the implicit message that my current choices were preventing me from achieving the goals that should matter most to any woman my age. The collective effect of all this well-intentioned advice was a constant pressure to abandon my interests and conform to expectations that had nothing to do with what actually motivated or fulfilled me. Every family gathering included multiple conversations about the changes I needed to make, the opportunities I was missing, and the practical steps I should take to align my lifestyle with conventional definitions of success and happiness. These ongoing discussions had created a family dynamic where my role was to be the problem that needed solving, the cautionary example that reinforced everyone else's satisfaction with their own choices. My resistance to their suggestions was interpreted as evidence that I couldn't see my situation clearly, that I needed more intensive intervention to help me understand what was really in my best interests. The most frustrating aspect of these repeated conversations was that they were always one-sided, focused on what I needed to change without any curiosity about what I might have learned or accomplished through my unconventional path. No one ever asked about my research discoveries, my professional consultations, or the satisfaction I derived from understanding American decorative arts history. They had decided that my interests were problematic, and no amount of evidence to the contrary could convince them to reconsider.
Their assumptions. Part 5. The performance mastery living this double life had required me to develop sophisticated strategies for maintaining the illusion of struggle while actually operating as a respected professional in a specialized field that most people didn't understand. The performance had become so natural that sometimes I almost forgot which version of myself was real, the struggling collector that my family worried about, or the expert consultant that auction houses and museums sought for her knowledge and judgment. The most challenging aspect of this deception was managing the financial contradictions that arose when my family tried to help me with problems I didn't actually have. When Dad offered to loan me money for car repairs, I had to remember to appear grateful while finding ways to decline assistance I didn't need.
When Aunt Dorothy suggested strategies for building an emergency fund, I had to listen thoughtfully to advice about accumulating savings that already exceeded her recommendations by substantial margins. These conversations required constant mental calculation to avoid revealing information that would contradict the narrative I was maintaining. I had to remember which expenses I had claimed to be worried about, which repairs I had mentioned needing to save money for, and which financial goals I was supposedly working toward. The cognitive load of tracking all these fictional concerns while simultaneously managing my actual business affairs had become exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. The storage units I maintained represented the most concrete manifestation of my double life, spaces where I could examine and research my collections without worrying about family members dropping by unexpectedly and discovering objects that contradicted their assumptions about my financial situation. I had arranged the rental agreements through a business entity rather than my personal name, creating an additional layer of separation between my collecting activities and my official identity as someone who struggled with too much stuff in a cluttered house. Each visit to the storage facility felt like stepping into my real life, surrounded by objects that represented years of careful research and strategic acquisition. The climate-controlled environment protected pieces that were worth more than most people's annual salaries, while the security system ensured that my most valuable discoveries remained safe from both theft and family interventions. These spaces had become my private museum, where I could study and appreciate American decorative arts without having to explain or justify my choices to people who couldn't understand their significance. The research library I maintained in Unit 49 had become essential to my consulting work, containing references and documentation that weren't available through public institutions. Auction catalogs from the 1920s provided provenance information that helped establish the exhibition history of important pieces. Correspondence files documented the collecting patterns of prominent early collectors, revealing how specific objects had moved through the market over decades. Technical references explained manufacturing processes and materials in ways that helped me identify authentic examples and spot sophisticated reproductions. This archive had taken 15 years to assemble and represented knowledge that couldn't be duplicated quickly or easily. The relationships I had built with dealers, collectors, and curators had provided access to information that was never published, shared only within the tight community of people who specialized in American decorative arts. Phone calls with other experts often provided attribution insights that resolved questions that had puzzled multiple institutions, collaborative discussions that advanced understanding for everyone involved. My consulting work had evolved into relationships with several major auction houses that regularly sought my opinion on difficult attributions and condition assessments. These assignments often involved examining pieces that were being considered for important sales, evaluating their authenticity and historical significance in ways that could dramatically affect their estimated values. My reports influenced catalog descriptions and marketing strategies for objects that sometimes sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The fees from this work had grown steadily as my reputation for accuracy and depth of knowledge became established within the professional community. Last year's income from consulting assignments had exceeded $50,000, generated through detailed research and analysis that drew on all the expertise I had developed through my collecting activities. This money had funded additional acquisitions and research trips while providing financial security that my family worried I was lacking. The most rewarding consulting assignments involved pieces that had been misidentified or undervalued by previous experts, situations where my research could restore proper attribution and recognition to important objects. A rookwood pottery vase that had been catalogued as a standard commercial piece turned out to be a unique experimental work by one of their master decorators, a discovery that changed its value from hundreds to tens of thousands of dollars. A group of silver spoons that had been dismissed as later reproductions proved to be early examples by a documented colonial silversmith, pieces that filled gaps in museum collections and scholarly understanding. These discoveries weren't just professionally satisfying, but emotionally fulfilling in ways that my family couldn't understand. Each successful attribution represented a small victory for historical accuracy and artistic recognition, ensuring that important objects received the respect and preservation they deserved. The detective work involved in these investigations engaged all my research skills while contributing to broader understanding of American decorative arts traditions. The professional relationships I had developed through this work provided intellectual stimulation and collaborative opportunities that compensated for the social isolation my family worried about. Phone conversations with museum curators often lasted for hours as we discussed attribution questions and shared information about related pieces in various collections. Email exchanges with other collectors and dealers created an informal network of people who notified each other about important discoveries and market opportunities. These professional connections had also led to opportunities that would have been impossible to access through conventional career paths. I had been invited to contribute to exhibition catalogs, participate in scholarly conferences, and serve on attribution committees that determined the authenticity of pieces being considered for major acquisitions. My opinions were cited in academic publications and auction records, creating a body of professional work that established my credibility within the field. But none of this recognition mattered to my family because they never asked about my professional activities and wouldn't have understood their significance if I had tried to explain them. To them, spending time researching old objects was just another example of my inability to focus on practical concerns that could improve my immediate circumstances. They saw someone who was so absorbed in impractical interests that she couldn't see opportunities for conventional advancement and financial security. The irony was that my unconventional path had actually provided exactly the kind of financial security and professional recognition they wanted me to achieve, just in a field they didn't respect or understand. My expertise had created opportunities for income generation that were based on knowledge and judgment rather than conventional employment structures. The collection I had assembled represented both personal satisfaction and substantial financial assets, even though my family saw only clutter and poor decision-making. Managing this contradiction had become increasingly difficult as my professional reputation expanded and my collection grew more valuable. Invitations to speak at conferences and contribute to publications created scheduling conflicts that were hard to explain without revealing the nature of my activities. Acquisition opportunities that required quick decisions sometimes conflicted with family obligations, forcing me to make excuses that reinforced their perception of my disorganized lifestyle. The storage costs, insurance premiums, and research expenses associated with maintaining my collection and consulting practice represented significant monthly expenditures that I had to hide from family members who worried about my ability to manage basic living expenses. These costs were investments in professional development and asset preservation, but they would have appeared irresponsible to people who thought I should be focusing on conventional forms of financial planning and career advancement. The emotional toll of maintaining this elaborate deception was something I hadn't fully anticipated when I first decided to keep my success private. The constant vigilance required to avoid contradicting the story I was maintaining had become exhausting, requiring me to remember details of fictional struggles while managing the actual complexities of professional consulting and collection management. Some days I felt like I was losing track of my authentic self, becoming so skilled at playing the role of struggling collector that I almost believed it myself. But tonight was going to change everything, though I had no way of knowing it, as I prepared for Dad's birthday celebration. Dr. Amanda Price's unexpected arrival would shatter the careful separation I had maintained between my professional reputation and my family identity, forcing me to integrate these two versions of myself in ways that would transform every relationship I had worked so hard to protect and preserve. Part 6, The Gathering and Initial Mockery. Dad's 67th birthday celebration was being held at the family home on Oakwood Avenue, the same modest ranch house where Michael and I had grown up, where every major family milestone had been marked for the past 3 decades. The living room had been decorated with blue and gold streamers, Dad's favorite colors, and Mom had arranged a spread of his preferred foods from Romano's Italian Kitchen, the local restaurant where our family had celebrated special occasions since I was a child. The guest list was predictably intimate, but represented everyone who mattered in our small family circle. Uncle Frank and Aunt Dorothy had driven over from their house across town, Mrs. Helen Carter had walked over from next door with a homemade apple pie, and Michael's family had arrived precisely on time in their pristine BMW, looking like they had stepped out of a catalog for successful suburban living. I had spent nearly an hour that afternoon carefully selecting my outfit for the evening, choosing a simple navy cardigan and khaki pants from Target that would reinforce the image of someone who shopped for practical clothing rather than investing in quality pieces. The jewelry I wore was deliberately modest, a basic silver chain and small earrings that looked like something from a department store clearance rack. Everything about my appearance was calculated to suggest someone who either couldn't afford better things or didn't understand the importance of presenting herself well. The contrast with Jennifer's appearance couldn't have been more stark. Michael's wife had chosen an elegant silk blouse and tailored wool pants that probably cost more than my entire outfit, accessorized with jewelry that demonstrated both her refined taste and her husband's financial success. Her hair was styled in the kind of effortless waves that actually required professional attention, and her makeup was applied with the skill of someone who understood how to enhance her natural beauty without appearing overdone. Emma and Tommy burst through the front door with the energy that 8 and 10-year-olds brought to family gatherings, immediately claiming hugs from their grandfather and grandmother before settling into the familiar routines of birthday celebrations. Emma carried a carefully wrapped present that she had chosen herself, while Tommy clutched a handmade card that featured a drawing of Dad fishing, one of his favorite retirement activities. The children's excitement was infectious, creating the kind of warm family atmosphere that made these gatherings genuinely enjoyable, despite the undercurrents of concern about my lifestyle choices that inevitably emerged during longer conversations. Dad settled into his favorite recliner, surrounded by family members who genuinely loved him and wanted to celebrate another year of his life, his face showing the kind of contentment that came from being surrounded by people who mattered most to him. Mom bustled around the kitchen, making final preparations for dinner and coordinating the logistics that made family gatherings run smoothly. She had prepared Dad's favorite meal of lasagna, garlic bread and Caesar salad, along with the chocolate cake that had been his birthday request for as long as I could remember. The familiar smells and sounds of family dinner preparation created a comfortable backdrop for the conversations and interactions that would unfold over the next several hours. As we gathered in the living room for appetizers and conversation before dinner, the family dynamics that had developed over years of similar gatherings began to assert themselves with predictable regularity. Michael naturally positioned himself as the center of attention, sharing stories about recent real estate deals and community involvement that reinforced his status as the successful son who had made smart choices and achieved recognition within their social circle. The Henderson property finally sold last week, Michael announced, accepting a beer from Dad and settling into the sofa next to Jennifer. 3 months on the market, but we got full asking price once the right buyer came along. Sometimes patience pays off better than price reductions. Uncle Frank nodded approvingly, always interested in hearing about Michael's business success and the strategies that had made him prosperous in a competitive field. That's the Riverside Heights property with the swimming pool. I drove past there last month and wondered who would end up buying something that expensive. Executive transfer from Columbus, Michael explained, clearly pleased to share details about his professional achievements. The company relocated their regional manager here, and they wanted something that would impress clients when they entertained. The pool and the location were exactly what they were looking for. Jennifer smiled with obvious pride in her husband's accomplishments, adding details about the staging work she had done to help the property show better to potential buyers. We brought in some contemporary furniture to replace the previous owner's traditional pieces. Sometimes people can't visualize how a space could work for their lifestyle until you show them the possibilities. These conversations about successful transactions and satisfied clients served multiple purposes within our family dynamic. They reinforced Michael's position as someone who had figured out how to navigate the modern economy effectively, while providing entertainment and vicarious satisfaction for family members who enjoyed hearing about prosperity and achievement. The specific details about prices, locations, and client preferences made the success feel concrete and impressive rather than abstract or theoretical. Aunt Dorothy was particularly interested in hearing about the financial aspects of Michael's deals, both because her banking experience helped her appreciate the complexity of large transactions and because she enjoyed the reassurance that came from knowing her nephew was thriving in uncertain economic times. Real estate seems to be recovering nicely from the recession, she observed. The bank is seeing more loan applications for higher-priced properties than we've handled in years. The market is definitely improving, Michael agreed, warming to a topic where his expertise was genuine and his success was undeniable. Inventory is still tight for quality properties, which helps sellers get good prices if they're patient about finding the right buyer. We're seeing multiple offers again on well-priced homes in desirable neighborhoods. Dad listened to these discussions with obvious satisfaction, proud that his son had built a business that served important needs within their community while providing financial security for his family. The combination of practical success and social contribution appealed to Dad's values about work and achievement, confirming that Michael had made choices that reflected well on the family's approach to raising children who could thrive in adult responsibilities. As the conversation continued, I found myself settling into the familiar pattern of being present but peripheral, close enough to participate if asked but far enough from the center of attention to avoid becoming the focus of concern or advice. This position had become comfortable over years of family gatherings, allowing me to observe the dynamics and interactions without having to defend my choices or explain my circumstances to people who wouldn't understand my explanations. Mrs. Helen Carter arrived just as Michael was finishing a story about helping young couple find their first home, bringing with her the apple pie that had become her traditional contribution to family celebrations. Helen had known our family since Michael and I were children, watching our development with the invested interest that longtime neighbors maintained in each other's lives and milestones. "Sarah, honey, you look tired," Helen observed, as she gave me a hug, her voice carrying the gentle concern that characterized most of her interactions with me. "Are you getting enough sleep? Sometimes when people have too much on their minds, it affects their rest and their energy." The comment was typical of the well-meaning observations that family friends made about my appearance and demeanor, always framed in terms of health and self-care rather than direct criticism of my lifestyle choices. Helen genuinely cared about my well-being, but her concern was based on assumptions about what my circumstances meant for my emotional and physical health, rather than any real understanding of my actual situation. "I'm fine, Mrs. Carter," I replied with the patient smile I had perfected for these interactions. "Just busy with some projects I'm working on. You know how it is when you get focused on something interesting." Helen nodded with the kind of understanding that didn't actually represent comprehension, interpreting my response as confirmation that I was dealing with the kind of overwhelming clutter and disorganization that prevented proper rest and relaxation. In her mind, my projects were probably attempts to organize my collections that kept getting derailed by my inability to make decisive choices about what to keep and what to discard. "Well, just remember that sometimes the best thing you can do is ask for help when things get overwhelming," Helen said gently. "There's no shame in admitting that a project is too big to handle alone. Sometimes an outside perspective can make all the difference." The suggestion hung in the air like an opening for family intervention, and I could see Mom and Aunt Dorothy exchanging meaningful glances across the room. These conversations had a way of developing momentum that carried them toward collective action, especially when well-meaning friends reinforced the family's concerns about my situation and need for assistance. Michael looked up from his conversation with Dad and Uncle Frank, his attention drawn by Helen's comments about my need for help with overwhelming projects. This was exactly the kind of opening that led to extended discussions about my circumstances and the various ways family members could contribute to improving my situation and helping me achieve better organization and life management. "What kind of projects are you working on, Sarah?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the patient interest that older brothers used when they were prepared to offer advice and assistance. "Maybe there's something we could help you with this weekend. I know Jennifer has some great ideas about organizing and storage solutions." The offer was genuinely meant to be helpful, reflecting Michael's belief that my problems were primarily logistical rather than fundamental disagreements about what constituted valuable possessions or meaningful activities. In his mind, I just needed better systems and more efficient approaches to managing my collections, problems that could be solved through the application of professional organizing principles and family labor. Jennifer immediately picked up on her husband's suggestion, her interior designer instincts engaging with what she saw as an interesting challenge that could benefit from her professional expertise. "I've been reading about some fascinating new approaches to decluttering and space optimization," she said enthusiastically. "There are some really innovative storage solutions that could help you create more functional living spaces while still keeping the things that are important to you." The conversation was developing along exactly the lines I had learned to expect, with family members building on each other's suggestions to create a collaborative plan for rescuing me from my supposedly chaotic circumstances. The assumption that my living situation represented a problem that needed solving was so deeply embedded in their thinking that they couldn't imagine any other interpretation of my lifestyle choices. "The main thing is establishing clear criteria for what to keep and what to let go," Aunt Dorothy added, drawing on her banking experience with evaluating assets and liabilities. "Sometimes people hold on to things for emotional reasons when they should be making practical decisions based on actual utility and value." Uncle Frank nodded in agreement, his automotive repair background providing ready analogies for dealing with objects that had outlived their useful purpose. "Same principle as with old cars," he said. "Sometimes you have to accept that something has given you good service, but it's time to move on to something more reliable and efficient." These comparisons between my collections and broken machinery, or worthless possessions, revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that shaped all their advice and concern. They couldn't imagine that old objects might have value beyond their original functional purpose, or that someone might choose to live with historical pieces because they appreciated their craftsmanship and significance rather than because they couldn't afford modern replacements. Tommy and Emma had been listening to this adult conversation with the kind of polite attention that children showed when family discussions touched on topics that didn't directly concern them. But Emma's natural curiosity prompted her to ask a question that cut through all the diplomatic language and indirect suggestions that the adults had been using. "Aunt Sarah, why do you have so much old stuff in your house?" she asked with the directness that only children could manage. "Couldn't you just buy new things that work better and look nicer?" The question hung in the air with uncomfortable clarity, expressing exactly what everyone else had been thinking but phrasing more diplomatically. Emma wasn't trying to be cruel or judgmental, just trying to understand why an adult would make choices that seemed obviously problematic to someone who had grown up surrounded by new, efficient, attractive possessions. "Some old things are really beautiful and interesting," I replied carefully, trying to find an explanation that an 8-year-old could understand without revealing information that would complicate the family's assumptions about my situation. Sometimes people made things
differently in the past, and those older ways of making things can be special. Emma considered this explanation with the seriousness that children brought to trying to understand adult behavior that didn't make obvious sense to them. "But don't you want your house to look nice like Mom makes other people's houses look? Wouldn't you be happier if everything matched and looked new?" The question revealed how completely Emma had absorbed her parents' aesthetic values and assumptions about what made living spaces attractive and functional. In her experience, beautiful homes were characterized by coordinated design elements, contemporary furniture, and the kind of visual harmony that her mother created for clients who wanted to achieve magazine-worthy interiors. Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't contradict the narrative I was maintaining, Mom called everyone to the dining room for dinner, providing a welcome interruption to conversations that were heading toward more intensive discussions about my need for help and guidance. The transition to birthday dinner temporarily shifted attention away from my circumstances and back to celebrating Dad's milestone and enjoying the family time that made these gatherings meaningful despite their complicated undercurrents. Part 7. The help session begins. As we gathered around the dining room table for Dad's birthday dinner, the conversation initially focused on the kinds of pleasant family topics that made these gatherings enjoyable. Memories of previous birthdays, updates on Tommy and Emma's school activities, and discussion of family vacation plans for the upcoming summer. Dad seemed genuinely happy to be surrounded by people who cared about him, and the atmosphere was warm and relaxed as Mom served the lasagna and garlic bread that had been his birthday dinner request. But as the meal progressed and the initial excitement of the celebration settled into more routine dinner conversation, the family's attention began to drift back toward the ongoing concern about my lifestyle and the various ways they might be able to help me achieve better organization and life management. These discussions always seemed to develop organically from innocent observations or questions, building momentum as different family members contributed their perspectives and suggestions. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what we talked about last month," Aunt Dorothy said as she passed the salad bowl, her voice carrying the careful tone that people used when they wanted to broach sensitive topics without causing offense. "About maybe setting up a basic investment account that could help you plan for the future. I could walk you through some options that might work well for someone in your situation." The offer was genuinely meant to be helpful, reflecting Dorothy's professional expertise and her concern about my apparent lack of conventional financial planning. In her mind, my focus on collecting old objects was preventing me from establishing the kind of savings and investment strategies that would provide security and flexibility for major life decisions like buying a house or planning for retirement. "That's really thoughtful of you," I replied diplomatically, trying to appear grateful for advice I didn't actually need. "I appreciate you thinking about my future. Maybe we could talk about it sometime when you have a chance to explain the different options." Michael looked up from cutting his lasagna, his attention drawn by any conversation that involved practical planning and financial responsibility. These topics engaged his business instincts and reinforced his position as the family member who had successfully navigated adult financial obligations and built prosperity through smart decision-making. "You know, Sarah, Dorothy's right about the importance of diversified investments," Michael said, settling into the advisory role that came naturally to him during family discussions about practical matters. "Real estate is obviously my specialty, but I've learned a lot about other investment strategies through working with clients who are building wealth for the long term.
The conversation was taking on the familiar tone of a consulting session, with successful family members sharing their expertise and guidance with the relative who needed help understanding how to make better choices and achieve improved circumstances. These discussions weren't intentionally condescending, but they created a dynamic where my role was to be grateful for advice and instruction from people who had figured out how to manage adult responsibilities effectively. Jennifer joined the conversation with observations about how financial security affected people's ability to make choices about their living environments and lifestyle preferences. One thing I've noticed with my design clients is that people who have solid financial foundations feel much more confident about making decisions and investing in improvements that really enhance their quality of life. Her comment carried the implicit suggestion that my cluttered living situation and resistance to change might be rooted in financial insecurity that prevented me from making the kind of bold decisions that could transform my circumstances. In her professional experience, people who lived with outdated furniture and accumulated possessions were often dealing with budget constraints that limited their options for creating more attractive and functional spaces. "The thing about old furniture and collectibles," Uncle Frank added, drawing on his experience with customers who held on to vehicles that were beyond economical repair, "is that they can seem valuable to the owner, but when you try to sell them, you often discover that other people don't see the same value. It's better to focus on things that hold their worth in the marketplace." Frank's observation reflected a practical worldview that emphasized utility and market value over sentimental attachment or aesthetic appreciation. In his experience, people who couldn't let go of old things were usually making emotional decisions that didn't align with rational financial planning and practical living requirements. Mrs. Helen Carter nodded in agreement, adding her perspective as someone who had watched many families deal with inherited possessions and estate planning challenges. "I've seen so many people struggle with cleaning out their parents' homes after they pass away. All those things that seemed important to the previous generation just become overwhelming burdens for the children who have to deal with them." Helen's comment carried a subtle warning about the long-term consequences of accumulating too many possessions, suggesting that my collecting habits might eventually create problems for other people who would have to manage my belongings if something happened to me. The implication was that my attachment to old objects was not just affecting my own life, but potentially creating future difficulties for family members who cared about me. Dad had been listening to this conversation with the thoughtful expression he wore when family discussions touched on practical matters that required careful consideration. His factory supervisor background had taught him to approach problems systematically, gathering information from multiple sources before developing action plans that could achieve positive results. "You know, Sarah," Dad said carefully, setting down his fork and giving me his full attention, "we're all concerned because we want you to be happy and secure. Maybe it would help if we could understand better what you're trying to accomplish with all your collecting. Sometimes when people explain their goals clearly, it's easier to figure out how to achieve them efficiently." The question was framed as an attempt to understand my perspective rather than a direct criticism of my choices. But it carried the assumption that my collecting activities must be aimed at some practical objective that could be evaluated and potentially improved through better planning and execution. Dad couldn't imagine that the collecting itself might be inherently satisfying rather than a means to some other end. The invitation to explain my goals created an opportunity for the kind of honest conversation that might have bridged the gap between my family's assumptions and my actual circumstances, but it also presented dangers that I wasn't prepared to navigate. Any detailed explanation of my expertise and professional activities would contradict the narrative I had been maintaining about my financial struggles and amateur status as a collector. "I guess I just enjoy learning about the history behind different objects," I said carefully, trying to provide an explanation that was truthful without revealing information that would complicate my situation. "There's something fascinating about understanding how people lived in different time periods and what they valued enough to preserve and pass down." Mom smiled with the kind of patient encouragement she had once shown students who were trying to explain concepts they didn't fully understand themselves. "That's wonderful, honey, and it's clear that you've learned a lot about antiques and decorative arts. But maybe there's a way to pursue that interest without having it take over your entire living space." Her suggestion reflected the common assumption that hobbies and interests should occupy appropriate portions of people's lives and homes rather than dominating their environments and daily routines. In Mom's mind, a healthy relationship with collecting would involve keeping a few representative pieces while maintaining the kind of organized, functional living space that supported other activities and relationships. There are lots of ways to enjoy history and beautiful objects without actually owning them, Jennifer added helpfully. Museums, historical societies, even television programs that focus on antiques and collectibles. You could get the intellectual satisfaction without the storage problems. Jennifer's suggestion revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what motivated serious collectors, the assumption that appreciation for historical objects could be separated from the physical experience of owning, researching, and caring for them. Her interior design background emphasized the visual and functional aspects of objects rather than their historical significance or the detective work involved in understanding their origins and development. Michael was nodding in agreement with his wife's observations, building on her suggestions with ideas about how I could redirect my interest toward activities that wouldn't require maintaining large collections or dedicating so much living space to storage and display. You could even volunteer with local historical organizations, he suggested. They're always looking for people who know about antiques to help with events and educational programs. The suggestion that I should volunteer my expertise rather than building my own collection reflected the family's assumption that my knowledge was amateur rather than professional, suitable for contributing to community organizations but not substantial enough to generate significant income or recognition within the field. They couldn't imagine that my expertise might already be valued by institutions and collectors who were willing to pay substantial fees for my consultations and opinions. Aunt Dorothy was particularly interested in the financial aspects of Michael's suggestion, seeing volunteer work as a way for me to redirect my collecting energies toward activities that wouldn't require ongoing investment in purchasing and storing objects. That's an excellent idea, she said enthusiastically. You could use your knowledge to help other people while building connections that might lead to paid opportunities in museums or auction houses. The irony of Dorothy's comment was profound, since I was already earning substantial fees from exactly the kind of professional relationships she was suggesting I should try to develop. But her assumption that I would need to start at the volunteer level reflected the family's complete misunderstanding of my actual expertise and reputation within the American decorative arts community. Tommy had been listening to this adult conversation with the kind of polite attention that children showed when family discussions focused on topics that didn't directly involve them. But he looked up from his lasagna with a question that cut through all the diplomatic suggestions and indirect advice. Why don't you just sell all the old stuff and buy new things that work better? He asked with the practical logic that children brought to problems that seemed to have obvious solutions. Then you could have a nice house like Mom and Dad, and everyone would stop worrying about you. Tommy's question expressed exactly what the adults had been thinking but phrasing more tactfully, revealing the fundamental assumption that shaped all their advice and concern. In their minds, my attachment to old objects was preventing me from achieving the kind of contemporary lifestyle that represented success and happiness in modern America. The suggestion that I should sell my collections and use the proceeds to create a more conventional living environment reflected their belief that the primary value of old objects lay in whatever money they might generate, rather than in their historical significance, artistic merit, or role in documenting American craftsmanship traditions. They couldn't imagine that someone might choose to live with antique furniture and vintage accessories because they genuinely preferred them to contemporary alternatives. Some people just have different tastes, I said gently, trying to respond to Tommy's question without contradicting the adult's assumptions or revealing information that would complicate my situation. What seems old-fashioned to some people might seem beautiful and interesting to others. Emma looked up from her dinner with the kind of serious expression that children wore when they were trying to understand adult behavior that didn't make obvious sense to them. But wouldn't you rather have things that match and look new? Don't you want your house to be pretty like the houses Mom designs for her clients? The question revealed how completely Emma had absorbed her parents' aesthetic values and assumptions about what made living spaces attractive and desirable. In her experience, beautiful homes were characterized by coordinated design schemes, contemporary furniture, and the kind of visual harmony that her mother created for clients who wanted to achieve magazine-worthy interiors. Before I could formulate an answer that wouldn't undermine the narrative I was maintaining, Uncle Frank decided to share his perspective on the practical problems created by attachment to old objects that had outlived their useful purpose. The thing is, Emma, sometimes people get so attached to things from the past that they can't see the advantages of modern improvements. Frank's comment was directed toward Emma, but his message was clearly intended for me, representing his belief that my collecting habits reflected an inability to embrace progress and efficiency. In his worldview, holding on to old things when newer alternatives were available demonstrated poor judgment and resistance to beneficial change. Take cars, for example, Frank continued, warming to an analogy that drew on his professional expertise. A 1950s automobile might have been beautiful when it was new, but it doesn't have the safety features, fuel efficiency, or reliability of a modern vehicle. Sometimes you have to let go of things you're attached to in order to get things that actually work better. The comparison between my furniture collections and obsolete automobiles reflected Frank's assumption that old objects were inherently inferior to new ones, valuable only for whatever sentimental attachment their owners might feel rather than for any practical or aesthetic qualities they might possess. He couldn't imagine that historical objects might have characteristics that made them preferable to contemporary alternatives, or that someone might choose them for reasons beyond emotional attachment. Mrs. Helen Carter was nodding in agreement with Frank's observations, adding her perspective as someone who had watched many families struggle with inherited possessions and estate planning challenges. Frank's absolutely right about the practical problems, she said. I've seen so many people keep things just because they belong to their parents or grandparents, even when those things don't really fit their current lifestyle or needs. Helen's comment carried the implicit assumption that my collecting activities were motivated by sentimental attachment rather than genuine appreciation for historical significance or artistic merit. In her mind, my resistance to decluttering reflected an inability to make rational decisions about which possessions were actually useful and which were just taking up space for emotional reasons. Part 8: Peak Humiliation and Intervention Planning. The conversation was gaining momentum as family members built on each other's observations and suggestions, creating the kind of collaborative planning session that had become familiar during previous gatherings when my situation became the focus of collective concern. What had started as gentle expressions of worry was evolving into a more systematic analysis of my problems and potential solutions, with each person contributing their expertise and perspective to what they saw as a necessary intervention. Dad set down his coffee cup and cleared his throat with the kind of deliberate gesture that signaled he was about to address a serious topic that required everyone's attention. I think we need to be honest about what we're seeing here, he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had used as a factory supervisor when addressing problems that couldn't be ignored any longer. Sarah, we love you, and that's exactly why we're concerned. You're 32 years old, and you're living in a way that's not sustainable. You can't keep accumulating more and more things without any plan for managing them or any clear purpose for what you're trying to accomplish. Dad's assessment was delivered with the kind of patient firmness that he believed was necessary when dealing with problems that required difficult conversations and potentially uncomfortable solutions. His factory management experience had taught him that avoiding problems only made them worse, and that effective intervention required clear communication about what needed to change. The storage costs alone must be eating up a significant portion of your income, Aunt Dorothy added, drawing on her banking experience to highlight the financial implications of my situation. And that's not even considering the money you're spending on acquiring new pieces when you already have more than you can properly display or maintain. Dorothy's observation about storage costs revealed that the family had been paying more attention to my circumstances than I had realized, noticing patterns and expenses that I thought I had kept private. Her banking expertise allowed her to recognize financial inefficiencies that others might miss, and her concern was focused on the long-term sustainability of spending patterns that seemed to prioritize collecting over practical financial planning. Michael leaned forward with the expression he wore when analyzing real estate deals that required careful evaluation of costs, benefits, and market realities. The thing is, Sarah, you're putting all your resources into assets that don't appreciate in value and don't provide any income or practical utility. From a financial planning perspective, it's like investing in vehicles that depreciate while requiring ongoing maintenance and storage costs. His analysis reflected a business perspective that emphasized return on investment and practical utility rather than aesthetic appreciation or historical significance. Michael's real estate expertise had taught him to evaluate possessions based on their potential for generating income or appreciating in value, criteria that made most antique collections seem like poor investment choices. Jennifer was nodding in agreement with her husband's assessment, adding her interior design perspective on the lifestyle implications of living surrounded by too many possessions. The psychological impact is really significant too, she said. Cluttered environments create stress and make it difficult to relax or feel organized. They can actually prevent people from entertaining guests or maintaining normal social relationships. Her professional experience had shown her how physical environments affected people's emotional well-being and social connections. And she genuinely believed that my cluttered living situation was contributing to isolation and anxiety that were preventing me from achieving the kind of balanced lifestyle that supported happiness and personal growth. Uncle Frank was ready with automotive analogies that drew on his decades of experience with customers who couldn't let go of vehicles that had become financial drains rather than reliable transportation. It's like keeping a classic car that looks beautiful but breaks down every time you try to drive it somewhere important, he said. At some point, you have to accept that sentiment doesn't outweigh practicality. Frank's comparison reflected his belief that my attachment to old objects was primarily emotional rather than rational, preventing me from making the kind of practical decisions that would improve my daily life and financial security. His auto repair business had shown him the problems that developed when people prioritized appearance or sentimental value over function and reliability. Mrs. Helen Carter had been listening to this analysis with growing concern, and she felt compelled to add her perspective as someone who had watched my development since childhood and worried about my long-term happiness and social integration. The isolation is what worries me most, she said, gently. When people become too focused on their possessions, they sometimes lose sight of the relationships and experiences that actually create fulfillment. Helen's observation touched on fears that had been developing within the family about my apparent withdrawal from normal social activities and romantic relationships. In their minds, my preoccupation with collecting was preventing me from investing time and energy in the kinds of human connections that led to marriage, family formation, and community involvement. Mom had been listening to this discussion with the kind of growing determination that characterized her approach to problems that required systematic intervention. Her teaching experience had shown her that some situations required coordinated action rather than gentle suggestions, especially when individual efforts to provide guidance weren't producing the desired behavioral changes. I think we need to stop dancing around this issue and develop a concrete plan for helping Sarah, Mom said, her voice carrying the organizational authority that had made her an effective classroom manager. We can't just keep having the same conversations without taking action to address the underlying problems. Her suggestion that the family needed to move beyond discussion toward intervention represented a significant escalation in their approach to my situation. Mom's teaching background had taught her to recognize when gentle encouragement wasn't sufficient to motivate necessary changes, and she believed that my resistance to previous advice indicated the need for more structured assistance. I agree completely, Michael said, his business instincts engaging with what he saw as a project management challenge that required clear objectives and systematic execution. Sarah needs help, and she's obviously not going to ask for it directly. Sometimes families have to step in when someone isn't capable of making necessary changes on their own. Michael's assessment reflected his belief that my resistance to their suggestions demonstrated an inability to recognize my own best
interests rather than a fundamental disagreement about what constituted appropriate lifestyle choices. His business experience had shown him that successful interventions required clear goals, adequate resources, and coordinated action from all stakeholders. Aunt Dorothy was already thinking about the practical logistics of a family intervention, drawing on her banking experience with evaluating assets and managing complex financial situations. The first step would be getting a realistic assessment of what she actually owns and what it might be worth, she said. We can't make good decisions about what to keep and what to sell without understanding the financial implications. Her suggestion that the family needed to inventory and evaluate my possessions reflected the assumption that I wasn't capable of making these assessments myself, either because I lacked the expertise to determine market values or because my emotional attachment to the objects prevented rational evaluation of their worth. Uncle Frank was already envisioning the physical aspects of a decluttering intervention, imagining how his experience with organizing automotive parts and tools could be applied to managing household possessions. We'd need to rent a truck and maybe a storage unit for sorting things into different categories, he said. Keep, sell, donate. Just like cleaning out a garage but on a bigger scale. Frank's practical approach reflected his belief that my problems were primarily organizational rather than stemming from different values or preferences about what constituted a desirable living environment. In his mind, I just needed help implementing the kind of systematic sorting and disposal processes that he used in his auto repair business.
Jennifer was thinking about the design possibilities that would emerge once my collections were reduced to manageable proportions, imagining how her professional skills could transform my living space into something that reflected contemporary standards for organization and aesthetic appeal. Once we create some space, I could help you establish better storage systems and maybe update some of the furniture to create a more cohesive look, she offered. Her suggestion reflected the assumption that my ultimate goal was to achieve the kind of organized, coordinated interior that appeared in design magazines, and that my current situation represented a failure to implement proper planning and execution rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize historical significance over contemporary aesthetics. Tommy looked up from his birthday cake with the kind of practical curiosity that children brought to adult conversations that involved interesting logistical challenges. "Are you going to have a big garage sale?" he asked. "Could Emma and I help by putting price tags on things?" Tommy's question revealed how the family intervention was being framed as a positive collaborative project that would benefit everyone involved rather than an imposition of outside judgment on my personal choices. The children's enthusiasm for participating in a garage sale reflected their understanding that the adults were planning something that would be fun and helpful rather than potentially devastating to someone who had spent 15 years building collections that represented both personal passion and professional expertise. Emma was equally excited about the possibility of participating in what sounded like an interesting family project. "Could we have lemonade and cookies to sell too?" she asked. "I've seen garage sales on TV where they have refreshments and it makes everything more fun." The children's innocent enthusiasm highlighted the complete disconnect between the family's understanding of what they were planning and the reality of what such an intervention would mean for someone whose collections represented both significant financial assets and the foundation of professional consulting work that generated substantial income. Mrs. Helen Carter was nodding approvingly at the collaborative spirit that was developing around this intervention plan, seeing it as an example of how families could work together to help members who were struggling with problems that seemed overwhelming when faced alone. "This is exactly the kind of support that Sarah needs," she said warmly. "Sometimes it takes a village to help someone make the changes that will improve their quality of life." Helen's endorsement of the family's intervention plan reflected the broader community perspective that saw my situation as a problem requiring external assistance rather than a lifestyle choice that deserved respect and understanding. Her support provided additional validation for family members who were convinced that they needed to take action to rescue me from circumstances that were preventing me from achieving normal happiness and social integration. The momentum building around this intervention plan was creating a sense of urgency and excitement that made it feel like an inevitable family project rather than a potentially destructive intrusion into my private life and professional activities. The collaborative energy was transforming what could have been seen as criticism into what felt like generous assistance from people who cared about my well-being and wanted to help me achieve better circumstances. But none of them had any idea that Dr. Price was already driving toward Millbrook following GPS directions to an address where she expected to meet with Ses. Mitchell, the knowledgeable collector whose expertise had helped her authenticate several important pieces for Heritage Auction House's upcoming American Decorative Arts sale. None of them could have imagined that within the next hour their intervention planning would be interrupted by the arrival of someone who treated me with the kind of professional respect that would completely contradict everything they believed about my circumstances and capabilities. Part 9. The catalyst arrives. The family's intervention planning was interrupted by the sound of a car door closing in the driveway, followed by the distinctive click of expensive heels on the concrete walkway leading to our front door. Through the dining room window I could see a sleek black Mercedes sedan with Ohio Heritage license plates, its polished surface reflecting the evening light like a mirror. My heart began racing as I recognized the vehicle and realized what was about to happen. Dr. Amanda Price stepped out of the car with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being treated with deference and respect. Even in the dim light filtering through our front windows there was no mistaking her professional authority. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her silver hair was styled in the kind of sophisticated cut that spoke of expensive salons and meticulous attention to personal presentation. Dr. Price was one of the most respected authorities on American decorative arts in the Midwest, with a reputation that extended far beyond the auction house world into museums, universities, and private collecting circles. Her expertise was sought by institutions that needed definitive attributions for pieces they were considering for major acquisitions, and her opinions could determine whether objects sold for thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars at prestigious auctions. Who could that be? Mom wondered aloud, setting down her coffee cup and moving toward the window for a better view of our unexpected visitor. We weren't expecting anyone else tonight, were we? The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrifying. Just as my family was finalizing plans to rescue me from my supposedly chaotic collecting habits, one of the most distinguished experts in American decorative arts was walking up to our front door, presumably to discuss the consultation work I had been doing for Heritage Auction House under the professional name S. Mitchell. Michael stood up from the table, straightening his tie with the automatic gesture of someone who wanted to make a good impression on unexpected guests. "That's a very expensive car," he observed, his real estate experience helping him recognize the kind of vehicle that suggested serious wealth and professional success. "Whoever it is, they're definitely not from around here." Uncle Frank was craning his neck to get a better look at the Mercedes, his automotive expertise allowing him to identify specific details about the vehicle that impressed him. "That's the new E-Class sedan," he said admiringly. "Probably runs about $60,000, maybe more with the options package. Someone's doing very well for themselves." The family's curiosity about our distinguished visitor was creating exactly the kind of attention that I had been hoping to avoid for the past 15 years. Dr. Price's arrival was about to shatter the careful separation I had maintained between my professional reputation and my family identity, forcing me to integrate these two versions of myself in ways that would transform every relationship I had worked so hard to protect and preserve. Aunt Dorothy was studying the license plate through the window, her banking experience making her naturally observant about details that might provide clues about people's backgrounds and circumstances. "Heritage Foundation," she read aloud. "That sounds like some kind of cultural or educational organization. Maybe they're fundraising for a local project." The irony of Dorothy's observation was profound, since Heritage Auction House was exactly the kind of prestigious institution that my family couldn't imagine having any connection to their supposedly struggling relative. The idea that someone from such an organization might be visiting me specifically was so far outside their assumptions about my circumstances that they couldn't even consider it as a possibility. Jennifer was smoothing her hair and checking her reflection in the dining room mirror, her interior designer instincts telling her to be prepared for meeting someone who might represent potential business connections or social opportunities. "Should I put on some coffee?" she asked. "If they're here about some kind of community project, we should probably offer them refreshments." The family's assumption that Dr. Price must be visiting for reasons related to community involvement or charitable fundraising reflected their complete inability to imagine that someone of her obvious professional stature might have business with me personally. In their minds, I was the family member who needed rescue from her chaotic circumstances, not someone who might be consulted by experts in prestigious cultural institutions. The doorbell rang with the kind of authoritative chime that seemed to demand immediate attention, and Dad automatically moved toward the front hall to answer it. His factory supervisor background had taught him to take charge of situations that required quick decision-making, and he was clearly prepared to handle whatever business this distinguished visitor might have with their family. "Good evening," came Dr. Price's cultured voice from the front hallway, carrying the kind of refined accent that suggested expensive education and sophisticated social connections. "I'm Dr. Amanda Price from Heritage Auction House. I have an appointment to meet with S. Mitchell about some authentication work we've been discussing." The words hit our dining room like a physical shock wave, creating a moment of stunned silence as every family member tried to process what they had just heard. Dr. Amanda Price from Heritage Auction House looking for S. Mitchell about authentication work. The implications were staggering, but none of them could quite grasp what was happening. "I think there might be some confusion," Dad replied politely, his voice carrying the careful respect that people used when dealing with obviously important visitors who seemed to have made some kind of mistake. "We don't have anyone here by that name. This is the Mitchell family, but we don't know anything about auction houses or authentication work." Through the archway between the dining room and front hall, I could see Dr. Price consulting her phone, checking the address she had been given and comparing it to the numbers on our house. Her expression showed the kind of professional puzzlement that experts displayed when confronted with unexpected complications in straightforward business arrangements. "This is 247 Oakwood Avenue?" she asked, her voice maintaining its polished professionalism despite obvious confusion about the situation. "I have an appointment with S. Mitchell at this address. We've been corresponding about several pieces that require expert evaluation for our upcoming American Decorative Arts auction. Michael had moved to the archway where he could observe this exchange, his business instincts engaging with what appeared to be a case of mistaken identity that needed to be resolved efficiently and diplomatically. "There must be some confusion about the address," he said helpfully. "We're Robert and Patricia Mitchell, and this is our son Michael Mitchell. We don't have any connection to auction houses or art authentication." The family was handling this situation exactly as I had expected they would, politely trying to redirect Dr. Price toward whatever address she was actually looking for while being respectful of her obvious professional standing and social position. None of them could imagine that the expert consultant she was seeking might be sitting at their dining room table, listening to this conversation with growing awareness that my carefully maintained double life was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. Dr. Price was clearly puzzled, but maintained her professional composure, checking her correspondence files on her phone to verify the contact information she had been using for months of communication with S. Mitchell. "I've been working with S. Mitchell for quite some time," she explained patiently. "Perhaps there's another family member who uses this address for business correspondence." The suggestion that someone in our family might be conducting business with Heritage Auction House was so far outside their experience and expectations that they couldn't process it as a realistic possibility. The idea that anyone they knew might have the kind of expertise that prestigious auction houses would seek for authentication work was simply beyond their comprehension. Mom had joined Dad and Michael in the front hallway, her curiosity about this distinguished visitor overcoming her natural reluctance to intrude on business conversations that didn't concern her. "Dr. Price, I'm Patricia Mitchell," she said politely. "I'm afraid we really don't know anyone who does authentication work. Are you sure you have the right address?" The family's collective certainty that Dr. Price had made some kind of mistake was creating a surreal situation where one of the most respected experts in American decorative arts was standing in our front hallway, trying to find the consultant she had been working with for months, while that consultant sat frozen at the dining room table, watching her carefully constructed facade about to collapse in spectacular fashion. Uncle Frank had joined the group in the hallway, his natural curiosity about the expensive Mercedes leading him to introduce himself and try to be helpful in resolving what seemed like a straightforward case of mistaken identity. "I'm Frank Hayes," he said, extending his hand with the friendly directness that characterized small-town social interactions. "Maybe the person you're looking for lives at a similar address in a different neighborhood." Aunt Dorothy was consulting her phone, searching for other Oakwood avenues in nearby towns that might have similar house numbers, her banking experience making her naturally systematic about resolving address discrepancies and communication problems. "There's an Oakwood Drive about 15 minutes from here," she offered helpfully. "Maybe that's where you meant to go." The family's eagerness to help Dr. Price find the right address reflected their genuine desire to be useful to someone who was obviously important and professional. But it was also creating an increasingly complicated situation as she became more confused about why her carefully verified contact information was leading her to people who claimed no knowledge of the consulting work she had been discussing with S. Mitchell for months. Tommy and Emma had abandoned their birthday cake to observe this interesting adult conversation, their natural curiosity about important visitors and mysterious business dealings drawing them toward the front hallway, where they could listen to the grown-ups trying to solve what seemed like an intriguing puzzle. "Maybe the person you're looking for moved away," Emma suggested with the helpful logic that children brought to problems that seemed to have obvious explanations. "Sometimes when people move, the new people don't know about the old people's business stuff." Dr. Price smiled at Emma's innocent attempt to be helpful, but her expression was growing more puzzled as she reviewed her extensive correspondence with S. Mitchell and tried to reconcile the professional relationship she had developed with this family's complete lack of knowledge about auction houses or authentication work. Mrs. Helen Carter had been listening to this conversation from the dining room doorway, and her neighborly instincts prompted her to join the group and offer whatever assistance she could provide in helping this distinguished visitor find the person she was looking for. "I've lived next door for 30 years, she said warmly. "I know everyone on this street, and I'm certain there's no one here who does antique appraisal work." The cumulative effect of all these helpful family members and neighbors trying to assist Dr. Price in finding the right address was creating a situation that was both comedic and terrifying. Here was one of the most respected authorities in American decorative arts, standing in our front hallway, being politely redirected away from the very person she had come to meet. While that person sat paralyzed at the dining room table, unable to figure out how to resolve this impossible situation without revealing everything she had been hiding for 15 years. Dr. Price was clearly becoming frustrated with what seemed like an increasingly complicated case of mistaken identity, but her professional training kept her voice calm and polite as she tried one more approach to resolving the confusion. "Perhaps I could speak with everyone who lives at this address," she suggested diplomatically. "Mitchell and I have been corresponding about some very specific pieces, and I'm certain this is the contact information I was given." The suggestion that she should meet everyone in the household was the moment I had been dreading, the point where my careful separation of professional and personal identities would inevitably collapse. There was no way to avoid this introduction without creating even more confusion and suspicion, and no way to participate in it without revealing everything I had been hiding from my family. I could hear my heart pounding as I stood up from the dining room table, knowing that the next few minutes would transform every relationship I had spent years carefully managing and protecting. The moment had finally arrived when Mitchell, the respected consultant, and Sarah Mitchell, the struggling collector, would have to become the same person in front of an audience that included everyone who mattered most in my personal life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.